Calvin Rhoades found the tracks on the morning of the 3rd of November 1908, 2 miles inside Sorrow Gap, at the place where the creek doubles back on itself and the limestone shelves lean out over the water like the prows of ships run aground. He was 51 years old, a fur trapper who had worked the ridges of Pocahontas County, West Virginia since before the turn of the century, and he had seen every track an animal leaves in those hills: bobcat, black bear, otter, mink, the wide dragged impression of a beaver working toward open water. What he found that morning beside the limestone shelf was none of those things. He crouched over the impression for a long time, long enough that the cold worked deep into his knees, and then he took out his field ledger and drew the shape of it on a blank page with the stub of a carpenter's pencil, measuring the width against the span of his own hand, because he did not trust himself to describe it in words and be believed. The ledger is the reason we know any of what follows. It was found 6 weeks later, tied to a fence post at the mouth of the gap, with a length of rawhide, the pages still damp in the middle, as though the book had spent time somewhere wet before someone carried it back out and left it there. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what Calvin Rhoades found in Sorrow Gap, you have to understand what the gap is, and why a man like him, methodical, cold-eyed, not given to stories, would have taken such care to write anything down at all. The gap is a notch cut through the spine of the Allegheny Highland, a narrow pass between two flanking ridges where the air funnels through a throat of hemlock and stone, and the wind on still nights carries a sound the families in the surrounding hollows described, when they described it at all, as arguing heard too far away to make out the words. The nearest settlement of any size was Marlinton, 14 miles of mud road and 2 creek crossings to the west. The county seat another 11 miles beyond that. In 1908, the original timber had been cut off the slopes and the forest was growing back young and thick, and that second growth held animals the way a good barn holds warmth: otter working the creek, mink running the bank burrows, fox moving the field edge above the logged cut. Calvin Rhoades ran a line of some 60 traps across a range that took 3 full days to check end to end, and he had been doing this every fall and winter for the better part of 20 years. He knew the country down to the specific flat stone he sat on when he ate his noon bread, knew which springs ran clear and which ran copper from the old ore workings above, knew the gap in particular because the creek through it held the best otter water in 3 surrounding counties. Sorrow Gap does not appear by name on any county survey. It shows on those maps only as an unnamed break in the ridge contour that the surveyors of the 1870s had measured and moved past without pausing. The name came from the families who had farmed the hollows flanking it for 3 generations, and no one living in 1908 could say what the sorrow referred to, only that the name had been old when their grandparents received it, and that no effort to change it had ever been made. In that kind of country, a name kept unchanged across 3 generations is generally considered accurate. The families who worked the surrounding hollows had practices they kept around the gap and did not explain to outsiders. They hunted the ridges above it and fished the creek above and below the cut, but not through it. They did not enter the gap after the light began to go in late afternoon. They did not answer anything that called from inside the tree line with a sound like a voice. Some of these families had been in that country since before the county had a government, and the practices were old enough that no one alive knew their origin, only that they had been kept without exception long enough to become a kind of reflex. Calvin Rhoades knew all of this and had found, in 20 years of working the gap, no reason to take it seriously. The otter water was good, the fox ground was good, and a man who has worked a piece of ground for 20 years without incident tends to trust the ground over the stories. The field ledger begins the way a working man's record begins: trap count, pelt quality, weather, the state of his supply of bait and trap wax. His handwriting is even and economical, the letters press slightly forward as if leaning into work. The animals are coming well. He takes a pair of otter on the 5th of November, a large mink on the 7th, a beaver on the 8th, that he notes as the largest he has taken out of the gap in 20 seasons. Then on the 9th, the morning he finds the track, the entries change, not in tone or vocabulary, but only in how long they take to say a thing. The beaver entry runs 3 lines. The track entry runs half a page, with measurements noted in a column along the margin, 8.5 inches from heel to the tip of the longest digit, 4.25 inches across the ball at the widest point, 5 distinct pressure points where the toes pressed independently into the mud. The weight behind the impression, estimated from its depth, was considerable. The stride, measured heel to heel between successive prints, was long enough that Calvin recorded it twice, once in the margin and once in the body of the entry. But the detail that required the full half-page was the absence of claw marks. Every large-footed animal that works that terrain, bear, wolverine, anything that grips, presses its claws into the mud ahead of the toe pads. These prints had none. The digits pressed down flat and clean and even, and Calvin Rhoades wrote that he had turned the problem over for the full time it took to eat his noon bread, and that the best answer he could reach was that whatever made the track either did not have claws or had learned, in some way he chose not to examine further, not to use them. He found a second set of tracks on the 11th of November, pressed into a mudflat below the limestone overhang on the far bank of the creek. They crossed from the east face of the gap to the west, in a line that was neither hurried nor wandering, the measured pace of something that knew where it was going and had no reason to rush. He followed them 60 yards before the ground hardened and they disappeared onto bare stone. The crossing had been made in the night prior, between when he passed the spot at dusk and when he came back at first light. He noted the temperature, 31 degrees. He noted that his campfire, burning 200 yards up the bank, was visible from the crossing point, and that whatever made the tracks would have been able to see his light. He reset his traps on the 12th, and found 3 sprung and empty on the morning of the 13th. Not tripped by weight, not damaged where the jaws had closed on something that then pulled free, sprung with deliberate downward pressure on the pan, the way a person disarms a trap when they mean to take it out of commission, and left open in the creek mud, with nothing taken and no tracks approaching or leaving. He walked the bank twice in each direction. He found nothing. He wrote 1 sentence at the bottom of that page, without comment or elaboration. Something has been going around the outside of my sets, and it has understood what they are. He did not pull the line. Calvin Rhoades was not a man who ran from a puzzle. He began instead to log not only what he caught, but what he found disturbed, and the 2 lists stopped having anything in common. Sorrow Gap was not the first stretch of ground in Pocahontas County to produce a record like this. In October of 1881, a 5-man survey crew entered the gap from the southern ridge to run a timber section line for a land acquisition company operating out of Baltimore, Maryland. 3 of them came out on the 4th day, 2 did not. The search, organized by County Sheriff Arden Marsh, who held the office from 1879 through 1892, covered the gap for 6 days and produced 3 recoveries entered in the daybook. A transit instrument found overturned at the creek margin, both tripod legs snapped cleanly at the collar as if something had pressed the entire frame flat from above. A field notebook opened to a page of instrument readings that stop at the midpoint of a column entry, the pencil line trailing off the ruled margin as if the hand holding it had simply ceased mid-stroke, and the survey chain, 66 feet of iron link, coiled on a stone ledge above the water with every individual link unsnapped from its neighbor, the entire length disassembled and recoiled with care. The 2 missing men were never found. Their names appear in the county death record as lost, cause undetermined, date approximate. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In the summer of 1902, a patent medicine and dry goods seller named Harlow Mace, 38 years old, driving a painted wagon on the Highland trade route between communities, pulled off the road at the mouth of the gap to water his horse at the creek. He was found 4 days later sitting on the road verge a quarter-mile from where his wagon still stood, the horse still hitched and unconcerned, the canvas cover on his goods undisturbed. Harlow Mace could walk, eat, and respond to his name. He could not account for the 4 days at all. The county physician called to examine him, a man named Elias Courtney who had practiced in Pocahontas County since 1894, set down his findings in a letter that survives today in a private family collection in Marlinton. Courtney noted that Mace's clothing was dry and clean and smelled of minerals rather than the outdoors, and that his boot soles showed no wear consistent with 4 days of travel. He noted one additional observation, set off from the rest by a full blank line, as if he had stopped and begun again. The man's fingernails had grown the equivalent of approximately 2 weeks' growth in 4 days. When Courtney pointed this out, Mace examined his own hands for a long moment without speaking, and then asked whether fingernails continued to grow after a person was dead. Elias Courtney applied for a transfer to a different county circuit the following spring. He practiced in Mercer County until his retirement without returning to Pocahontas County in any record that survives. Calvin Rhoades's ledger gives no sign that he knew about either case. He was a trapper, not a historian, and the county records that would have told him sat boxed in a courthouse basement 14 miles away. What he had was what the Gap was showing him, and in the days following the 13th of November the instruction continued. The traps continued to be sprung without captures. The tracks continued to appear on mornings following nights cold enough that most animals went still. Then, on the 18th of November, a detail enters the record, noted without interpretation. He has been counting the toe impressions in each print since the 3rd, 5 in every set he has measured. The fresh prints on the morning of the 18th show 4 toe pressure points. The prints on the morning of the 20th show 6. Same stride, same absence of claw marks, same deliberate line of travel east to west through the Gap. A different number of toes. He records both counts and writes nothing else. On the 21st of November, one of his own traps is returned. A small fox snare that had gone missing 10 days earlier is reset and baited on a game trail he has not worked, using a bait he does not recognize, something dark and waxy set in a split stick above the pan, the arrangement neat and practiced. He does not spring it. He draws it in the ledger instead, the stick and bait and set reproduced in careful lines, and writes beneath, "It sets a better bait than I do. I do not know what it is using." On the 22nd, 3 more returned traps appear, all reset in positions he would have chosen himself given the game sign in the area, all baited with the same dark waxy material. He springs all 3 and fills the next several pages with descriptions of the bait, color, approximate weight, texture under the fingers. He does not describe the smell. He writes only, "I will not describe the smell. Anyone who found it would know it at once. Anyone who has not would not believe me." The final full entry is dated the 23rd of November, 1908. It is the longest passage in the ledger, written in a hand that is still controlled but pressed harder into the paper than anything before it, the letter impressions running through several following pages like a blind record of the words. He writes that on the night of the 22nd he woke to a sound he had heard twice before in his life, once at the death of his mother and once at the death of his horse. He calls it the sound a thing makes when it stops pretending it is only one thing. He writes that it came from the direction of the creek and lasted approximately 4 minutes by his pocket watch, and that during those 4 minutes he did not move and did not light his lantern. When it stopped, the Gap went quiet in a way that had a quality to it, not the ordinary quiet of late night and cold, but the quiet of something listening back. He waited until full light to leave the camp. He went to the creek and found a single track on the far bank, pressed 1 hand's width into the mud, the toes down flat and clean. The count was even. The weight behind it was more than his own body could have produced. It faced his camp. It faced, he wrote, precisely where he had lain. He writes that he has come to understand what has been happening in the Gap, and that he is not certain a person can withdraw from it, once they have become part of it. He writes that he intends to record everything he knows and leave the ledger where it can be found. He writes that whoever finds it should understand that the traps in Sorrow Gap are still set. He writes that they have not been his traps for some time. That is the last complete sentence in the ledger. Below it, in a hand that has finally lost its steadiness, are 11 more lines that the man who found the book at the fence post could only partially read, and that a second reader consulted 3 years later could only partially read in the same places, and that a third reader, who examined the pages under magnification 60 years after that reported, were not illegible from deterioration, but appeared to be written in a script he did not recognize as belonging to any language he could identify. The shapes were deliberate. They had not been made in haste or fear. They were formed by someone who had spent time learning to make them correctly. Beneath those 11 lines there is a drawing that takes up the remainder of the page and continues across the inside back cover. It reproduces the track from the 3rd of November at the same scale, measured against the same hand. The original drawing shows 5 pressure points. This one shows a number that all 3 readers disagreed on, except in one particular. All 3 stated that whatever the number was, it was too many. Calvin Rhoades was never found. His brother Otis Rhoades, a cattle farmer of Hillsborough, West Virginia, organized a search that covered Sorrow Gap and the surrounding ridges through December of 1908 and produced nothing. No remains, no camp equipment beyond what was left with the ledger at the fence post. No trace of the 60-trap line he had worked for 20 seasons. The County Sheriff's Daybook records the search in 3 short lines and closes with the notation that the gap showed no evidence of recent habitation. The ledger is not mentioned. The tracks Calvin measured across 11 pages of the book are not mentioned. Those 3 lines are the only entry in any county record that places Calvin Rhoades at Sorrow Gap in the fall of 1908 at all. His field ledger is held today by a descendant of Otis Rhoades, still living in Pocahontas County, who has read it twice and will not read it a 3rd time but has not destroyed it. The fence post where it was found is gone. The creek runs the same course it ran when Calvin last walked the bank. The limestone shelves still lean out over the water, still holding mud in the low places, still capable of taking a clean impression when something with a long stride chooses, on a cold morning, to cross. The ledger's last complete sentence has been quoted in full by every person who has read the book, without elaboration, because it does not need any. He wrote that whoever found it should understand that the traps in Sorrow Gap are still set and have not been his traps for some time. What the 23 days of entries before that sentence make plain, if you read them in order and count the toe marks and follow the trap line from the 3rd of November to the 23rd, is which one of the 2 of them had been the trapper all along, and how long the line had been baited before Calvin Rhoades ever walked into the gap that fall, and what kind of patience it takes to wait in the dark for the last man who still knows where to look, and to set one return snare at a time until the man who should have walked out 2 weeks ago understands, too far in, which one of them was never the hunter. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.